when we say this term, the phenomenon, partly why that's complex is because right now anything that doesn't fit nicely within reductionistic materialism kind of gets lumped into one thing when actually it might be many, many things. And eventually we'll realize how limiting and kind of silly that assumption was, that it's just all one thing. Again, I think that's sometimes because of intellectual laziness and sometimes intellectual arrogance that we think we've mostly got things figured out. I think we should be much more humble about that. I think scientific history tells us to be humble about that. We think about prior to the quantum revolution, which, by the way, also points in these directions. Um, Most scientists were going around thinking we're just, down into the fine details now, crossing T's and dotting I's. And then suddenly the quantum experiments with the double slit experiment and whatnot came out, and everyone said, wait a second, everything we think about reality seems turned upside down. What does this mean? And still, really, in science, we're still not really fully grappling with that, trying to find ways to get around it because it's so discombobulating in terms of what it points to in terms of reality. When you have things like this notion that it's not until you have an observer or some kind of consciousness interacting that reality seems to collapse into one frame of being rather than another, which is, again, pointing in this direction, which also, I think, is kind of overwhelming sometimes because it starts to tell us we might have a much more prominent role to play in what we experience than we think we do. And that this notion that there's a fixed objective out there and then there's us perceiving it, that kind of gets blown away by this data as well, which is fascinating. So that said, a few things you could try. I'm big on trying to experience non-ordinary state experiences because, again, as I said earlier, I think the evidence is suggesting that gives us a lens into more of reality, not less, and not some sort of alt reality, but actually more of reality. That our evolutionary drive has helped us to narrow our frame of reference so we can survive and propagate the species, but that means limiting a lot that we could be exposed to. So by taking psychedelics, for instance, you can encounter a broader frame of reality. By getting into deep meditative states, which sometimes takes a bit longer, but you can also get into those broader frames of reality. In terms of encountering these phenomena that people see in the sky, CE5 or HICE, human initiated contact events, are something else you can try where you can join up with people. You go out into the field at night and you kind of have a shared intention to make positive contact with benevolent beings. Very important that you have a very set intention, which again speaks to the fact that we might have a bigger role to play in here in terms of what we actually experience in reality than we think. Might speak to kind of a quantum activism. And in that, people regularly encounter seeing things. And then in my case, for instance, I had that happen at a private retreat I went to at the Monroe Institute, but then also started receiving telepathic communication and downloads, as they say. It's often not as specific as here's our 5 questions. Can you give us precise answers? It's not necessarily like that. Um, but and there's also certain borders that won't be crossed if it infringes on free will, for instance, and that kind of thing. So it's kind of a situation almost like with when you're trying to help educate a child. You don't want to do the homework for them, but you kind of want to give hints. What do you think about looking in this direction? Look over here. What about this? And so in my case, it tends to be less, here's a paragraph that describes exactly what the answer is, and more my awareness becomes focused on what about this direction? Maybe you should check out this. Maybe you should connect with this person. Maybe you should read this book, even if it's an obscure book sometimes. And then over time, you start recognizing there's a consistent leading that's been happening. So it's kind of like that. For other people, I would say this is where it does get a little bit tricky because, for instance, my co-host on Liminal Frames will sometimes be surprised and I think a bit confounded by, for instance, one friend of mine that I was at the Monroe Institute retreat with. As soon as she started investigating this phenomenon, she started having experiences. And even after she published some papers in the mainstream, then her daughter started having experiences. So as people say sometimes, the more you look into this phenomenon, it begins to look back at you. So that does happen for many, many people, but not necessarily everyone. Because again, my co-host on Liminal Frames has said kind of surprisingly, I must be immune. He's wondering why he hasn't had that direct kind of experience. Maybe for some people, it's just much more subtle and subconscious than for others. We're not exactly sure. There's interesting research being done by people like Gary Nolan pointing towards biomarkers, right? Biological differences in some people that seem to hint that perhaps different genetic backgrounds are more predisposed to these kinds of experiences. Um, People with a Celtic background, which includes me, people with indigenous backgrounds, Cherokee Indians, different kinds of American Indian. Um, RD6 Clear Clark is an author who is gone around the world collecting accounts from indigenous cultures. I'd really encourage people to check out her work. Seems very much not just part of their individual lives, but part of their understanding of their identity as a collective as well, that they somehow are tied to what they call these star people. Um, so this is what I mean when I say that this leads in every other direction: human origins, genetics, the question around are we a seeded species, right? To begin with, when I had that conversation with Bernardo Castro, he said, as much as it sounds preposterous to assume that we've been engineered by some sort of alien intelligence, that seems the less of a stretch than the other notion that somehow just naturalistically, accidentally, it all sort of came together in some sort of miracle. Um, so all that is to say, yes, like I said before, I would say aim for non-ordinary state experiences, expand your understanding of what is real. And then often you'll begin to have encounters with beings in those kinds of non-ordinary states. And be open to what's being communicated to you there. And again, through things like CE5 or HICE, join together with people. I know here in the US, a lot of cities will have CE5 groups that you can contact. Not sure how common it is in Europe, but maybe think about starting it up with some people. Just do a little research around. Again, you want to prepare yourself. You want to preferably develop a meditative practice ahead of time. You want to have a clean inner life kind of thing. Because again, our intention seeds these experiences so much. Like I sometimes describe it as the intention you bring in, whether you're aware of it or not, is like the number you're calling and who picks up on the other side. So you want to spend some time being aware of that, being aware of what you're populating into the field energetically. I know some people will say this sounds like New Age. What's this got to do with the UFO phenomenon? But somehow it's all connected. This is the point. That I think many scientists, many artists across history have had the same experience, but they just haven't known that's what it was. Many artists and scientists will tell you that it's almost like a mystical experience when they sometimes have an idea occurred to them in a dream or something or overnight. And we've just assumed that there's not these middlemen of these beings that might be doing this, but I think there's lots of evidence that that is what's happening. Um, so that pretty robustly changes my day to day, actually, because it becomes not only ongoing research and helping to educate other people about this as I learn more about it, but ongoing interaction where some elements of this phenomenon, in other words, some of the intelligences seem to be very much involved in trying to help humanity get through a really difficult time we're going through right now. I've been talking about this in the podcast quite a bit, where there's numerous extinction level threats online at the same time in our time. And many people just feel so overwhelmed by that and are so busy in their lives, speaking of day to day, that they just sort of tune out and feel powerless. Um, but I'm very much aware of what's arising. And I think that, and this speaks to what I was saying before about, I don't think it's going to be sideline material for too much longer, because I think that everything's kind of spiraling up into some sort of climax point, is what it seems like, where as humanity races further and further along technologically, moving on towards artificial general intelligence, moving towards this technological singularity, without our shared collective consciousness really keeping pace with that. While that's chasing along, and we seem to be imminently approaching that, we're also seeing an uptick in the kinds of contact that's happening with this element or elements of the phenomenon, where people either are seeing more things, they're receiving more telepathic downloads. This seems to be ramping up as well, where again, I think some of them recognize that it'll be very ontologically disruptive for us to be suddenly aware that they're in our midst, and they always have been. So they're slowly turning up the temperature so that we become almost on a grassroots level more and more aware of them. So that when it finally comes a day where that becomes clear that they have been here, they are part of our reality, it's been seeded in such a way that it doesn't cause so much shock. And again, there's even been people like John Ramirez, ex-CIA, who have said plainly that elements of US intelligence know that something's going to happen around 2027, not necessarily something cataclysmic, but something where revelatory, where these beings become known in some massive way. And that this slow rollout of disclosure has been very purposeful with that end in mind, that it's to prepare psychologically the masses for what is going to perhaps happen. So I think that's why not only are they upping their interaction with humanity right now, but it's tied to this sort of cataclysmic, consequential moment we're reaching as a species as well, where we're straining the planet. I think all of us this last summer have been very, very aware of climate change and what's happening there. Of course, this is exactly what some of the warnings entailed back in the 1990s. Even for the kids in Zimbabwe, they were warned about technology and what that might do and where it might take us. So all this seems to be somehow connected. So it absolutely changes every day of my life. I pretty much live and breathe this kind of topic. And I think more and more people are slowly becoming aware of it, not just through the news. That's less of it, actually. It's more because slowly but surely, on a grassroots level, people are being contacted and slowly being made aware of these additional presences.